The evening air was calm, the surface of the lake smooth like glass reflecting the last light of the setting sun. Birds circled lazily above the water, their wings catching the orange glow, while the faint smell of pine trees drifted from the forest nearby. It was a quiet place, a place where people came to escape the noise of town, where families gathered in the summer and where one man found his only peace after long, difficult days. His boat sat tied to the dock, rocking gently in the water, its wooden frame polished by years of care. It was not a new boat, not the kind of thing one showed off to impress others. But to him it was priceless. It had been his father's once, then passed down to him. Every nail, every board, every rope held memories of evenings fishing with his family, mornings rowing under a foggy sky, and afternoons sitting in silence on the water when life felt too heavy. The boat was more than wood. It was the last piece of his family that still felt alive. He walked down the dock, his boots creaking on the old planks, and placed a hand on the cool edge of the boat. He smiled faintly as he untied the rope and let the boat drift slightly, planning to sit on the water until the stars came out. But then a sharp sound broke the quiet. A crack, a hiss, and then, flames. At first it was small, a faint orange flicker licking at the back of the boat. He blinked, confused, wondering if the sunlight was playing tricks on his eyes. But the flicker grew, spreading along the wooden boards, sparks jumping like angry insects. In seconds, fire raced across the boat, climbing the ropes, reaching for the small cabin at the center. The man froze, his heart slamming in his chest. He could feel the heat from where he stood on the dock, the flames roaring louder than the birds that scattered into the sky. The water reflected the fire like a mirror, turning the calm lake into a sea of dancing orange and red. Neighbors rushed out of their homes, drawn by the smoke rising into the sky. They gathered at the edge of the lake, their voices rising in gasps and whispers. "Oh my God, it's his boat," someone cried. "Who would do this?" another asked. Children clung to their parents, wide-eyed as the boat cracked and splintered under the heat. Some neighbors looked horrified, others only curious, their eyes darting nervously to each other. But not all the faces showed shock. At the edge of the crowd stood two men and a woman, dressed neatly though the evening was casual. They were members of the HOA board. They did not gasp. They did not move to help. They only stood with their arms crossed, their lips twisted into small, satisfied smiles. They watched the fire with a kind of cruel enjoyment, as if the flames were not destroying a man's memories but proving a point. Their eyes flicked toward the man standing on the dock, as if daring him to react. But he did not move. He did not shout. He did not rush forward with a bucket of water or throw himself toward the burning boat. He stood still, his hands at his sides, his face calm. His neighbors watched him in confusion, some whispering, "Why isn't he doing anything?" That boat was everything to him. But he stayed silent, his eyes fixed on the flames. The boat groaned as the fire ate through its ribs. The mast toppled, crashing into the water with a hiss of steam. Sparks rose into the darkening sky, drifting toward the forest before fading away. The fire lit up the man's face, his eyes reflecting the orange glow, but there was no panic in them. Only silence. Only patience. One neighbor whispered, "He must be in shock." Another muttered, "He should call the fire department." But still he did nothing. He simply watched as the last piece of his father's boat crumbled, sinking into the water with a heavy splash. The flames hissed and died, leaving only black smoke curling upward, the smell of ash drifting over the lake. The crowd began to disperse slowly, shaking their heads, whispering rumors. Some felt pity for him, others thought him strange, unable to understand why he hadn't fought the fire. But the HOA leaders stayed behind a moment longer, their smiles thin, their eyes cold. They wanted him to see. They wanted him to know this was only the beginning. Then they turned and walked away, their voices low and smug. The man stayed on the dock long after the others had left, staring at the blackened pieces of wood floating on the water. His fists clenched at his sides, his nails digging into his palms. To anyone watching, he looked broken. But deep inside, something else stirred. He knew this was not an accident. He knew who had done it. And he knew why they had done it. to scare him, to make him bend, to force him to surrender to their endless demands and threats. But instead of breaking him, the fire had lit something else. Not rage, not yet. Something colder. Something sharper. Slowly, he turned and walked back up the dock, his boots echoing in the night air. He passed the neighbors who avoided his gaze, past the homes where people shut their curtains, too afraid to stand with him. He walked into his house, locked the door, and sat at his desk. The folder lay there, filled with papers he had been collecting for months. Bank statements, HOA budgets, inconsistencies, strange payments, money that vanished into accounts no one could trace. He placed his hand on the folder, his eyes calm, steady. They had burned his boat to scare him. But they had forgotten something. Fire destroyed wood and rope. It could not destroy the truth. It could not erase the trail of money they had stolen, the fraud they had hidden, the power they thought no one could touch. He leaned back in his chair, his lips curving into the faintest of smiles. The boat was gone, but it was only a boat. Their empire, their accounts, their wealth, that was still vulnerable. And unlike a boat, when those things burned, they would never float again. Outside, the smoke still rose from the lake, the smell drifting through the neighborhood like a warning. But inside, the man's silence grew heavier, his patience sharper. He whispered to himself, his voice low but steady. "You burned my boat. Now I'll burn everything you own." The morning after the fire, the smell of smoke still lingered in the air. Blackened pieces of wood floated at the edge of the lake, drifting slowly as if mourning what once had been. Neighbors avoided looking at the dock, their eyes dropping whenever they passed, whispering to each other in low voices. Some said it was an accident, others insisted it was vandalism, but everyone knew the truth even if no one dared to say it aloud. The man walked down to the water in silence, his boots crunching on the damp soil. He stood at the edge of the dock, staring at the wreckage, his face calm as stone. To anyone watching, he looked like a man who had lost everything, a man too broken to fight back. But inside his mind, each passing second was sharpening into a plan. By noon a letter arrived. It was slipped under his door, the paper heavy with the HOA's official seal stamped at the top. He opened it slowly, reading line after line of neatly typed threats. The letter accused him of violations, claiming his boat had been an unapproved structure. They fined him thousands of dollars for safety risks, blaming him for the fire they themselves had started. It warned him that more fines would follow, and if he did not comply, they would place liens on his property and drag him into court. At the bottom, the signature of Richard Cole, the HOA president, stretched smugly across the page. The man read it twice, his expression never changing. He folded the letter neatly, set it on the table, and poured himself a glass of water. Outside, the neighborhood was alive with whispers. Two women stood on the sidewalk, glancing toward his house. "Did you hear?" one murmured. "The HOA fined him. They say his boat caused the fire." The other woman shook her head nervously. "It's strange. He hasn't said a word. He just walks around like nothing happened. If it were me, I'd be screaming." The first leaned closer, her voice dropping lower. "That's what scares me. Maybe he knows something." That evening, 3 members of the HOA board came to his door. They didn't knock politely. They pounded with heavy fists until he opened. Their faces carried smug confidence, their voices dripping with fake authority. Richard Cole held another paper in his hand, waving it like a weapon. "You've been fined again," he announced. "Failure to pay will result in further action." The man glanced at the paper, then looked back at Cole, his face calm. "You burned my boat," he said softly. Cole's smirk faltered for just a second before returning. "You can't prove that. What you can prove is that you violated community rules. Pay your dues, or things will get worse." The man said nothing. His silence pressed on them like a weight, making even the board members shift uncomfortably. They wanted anger, shouting, some sign of weakness. Instead, they found a wall they could not read. Cole shoved the paper into his chest and turned sharply. "You have 1 week," he barked before walking away, his allies following. Neighbors watched from windows, their curtains shifting as the confrontation played out. Some pitied the man, others whispered that maybe the HOA was right, maybe silence meant guilt. But when the man closed the door, he didn't throw the paper aside in despair. He placed it next to the first letter on his table and sat quietly. He reached into his folder and pulled out a stack of documents he had been keeping hidden. HOA budgets, bank reports, meeting minutes. He had spent months watching them, tracing their steps, noting every lie. Now he began matching their threats with their thefts, their fines with the missing dollars in their accounts. As the hours passed, his desk filled with notes and copies, a map of corruption spread before him. Outside, the HOA felt stronger than ever. They walked through the neighborhood with smug smiles, telling homeowners about new improvements and community growth. They spoke of the man as if he were finished, another victim crushed under their rules. But every threat they made, every dollar they demanded, was another step into the trap he was building. Days passed, and the HOA's pressure grew. More letters came, more fines stacked up. Cole called meetings where he mocked the man openly, smirking as neighbors laughed nervously along. A fool, he called him. A man who thought he could live above the rules. Now he'll pay the price. Each insult was meant to crush him, but he never reacted. He simply walked past them, silent, his calm expression making even the boldest laugh falter for a moment. At night he worked, piecing together proof of their fraud. He traced the HOA's expenses, following money that disappeared into private accounts. He studied bank transfers that had no explanations, payments marked for community upgrades that had never happened. He built a case stronger than fire, stronger than threats, something they could never laugh away. One evening as he sat by the window, the last of the charred pieces of his boat drifting quietly at the edge of the lake, he whispered to himself. His voice was low but sharp, carrying the weight of a promise. They think fines will break me. They think the days after the fire were heavy with silence. The neighbors avoided eye contact when he walked past, whispering to each other when they thought he couldn't hear. Some pitied him, others thought he had already given up. The HOA board walked around like kings, their smiles smug, their voices loud whenever his name was mentioned. He'll break soon, Richard Cole told a group of homeowners one morning, his laugh sharp and cruel. He can't stand against us. He has no money, no support, nothing left. The others laughed nervously, some agreeing only because they feared what would happen if they didn't. But inside his small house by the lake, the man worked in silence. Every evening he sat at his desk, the charred smell of his boat still drifting through the air outside, and spread out papers across the wooden surface. Letters from the HOA, copies of notices, meeting minutes he had quietly requested from the county office, bank statements he had managed to obtain. He had spent weeks before the fire tracing small details, sensing something was wrong. Now he focused on them with sharp attention, his eyes moving steadily over every line, his pen circling inconsistencies. The more he read, the more he saw patterns. Payments labeled as maintenance, but with no record of any work. Large sums taken from homeowners' dues, transferred into private accounts. Contracts written to companies that didn't even exist. The deeper he looked, the uglier it became. The HOA was not just greedy. They were thieves. And the fire had not been just intimidation. It had been a warning, stop asking questions, or lose more. But instead of fear, it gave him clarity. He began keeping notes in a small black notebook, writing in neat, simple lines. Dates, amounts, names, each thread leading to another. Slowly, a map of corruption appeared before him. By day he acted calm, walking the same streets, nodding to the same neighbors, his face unreadable. The board thought his silence was weakness, that he was too broken to fight. But his silence was patience. And every quiet night, with the lamp burning low and papers spread like a battlefield before him, he was sharpening his blade. One evening he drove quietly to the county clerk's office. The building was nearly empty, just one tired employee behind the desk. He requested HOA filings, financial disclosures, anything that was public record. The clerk gave him a stack of files with little interest. He carried them home, his heart steady, and read through them until dawn. What he found made his jaw tighten. The HOA had been overcharging homeowners for years, claiming funds for projects that never existed. Roads they never repaired. Parks they never built. Security systems that had never been installed. And all that money had gone straight into the accounts of board members, hidden under false company names. It wasn't just greed anymore. It was fraud. Criminal fraud. He knew then that he didn't need to fight them with fire or fists. He had something far stronger. Proof. But proof alone was not enough. He needed timing. He needed them confident, arrogant, believing they had already won. Only then would the strike hurt the most. So he waited. At HOA meetings, he sat quietly at the back, listening to them boast about their control, their fines, their authority. They mocked him openly, laughing that his boat had been destroyed, that he was now nothing. He never responded. He never argued. He only listened, memorizing every careless word they said, every promise they made that he knew was built on lies. Neighbors grew uneasy with his silence. Some whispered, "Why doesn't he fight back?" Others muttered, "Maybe he's scared." But the truth was darker. He was waiting for the perfect moment. At night he made copies of the most damning documents, tucking them into envelopes, labeling each one carefully. He contacted people quietly, an attorney, a county investigator he trusted, even a reporter from a nearby town who had once exposed corruption in another HOA. Each time, he sent only a piece, never the full picture. Enough to catch interest, not enough to reveal the storm he was preparing. By the end of the week, the board noticed nothing. They were too busy celebrating their so-called victory, bragging about the lesson they had taught him by burning his boat. They walked through the neighborhood as if untouchable, their heads high, their voices loud. But late at night, when they swiped their cards at restaurants or checked their balances, they had no idea that soon those very accounts would be the ones burning. The man sat by his window, the lake dark and silent under the moon. He thought of his father, of long evenings spent fixing that old boat together, of the lessons about patience and strength. He thought of the fire, of the cold smiles of the board members, of their arrogance. And then he thought of the folder on his desk, heavy with proof, heavy with power. He whispered into the night, his voice steady. "You wanted a war. You lit the fire. Now you'll feel the cold." The night of the HOA's gathering was loud with laughter and music spilling from the clubhouse at the center of the neighborhood. The big glass windows glowed warmly against the dark sky, and cars lined the street outside, each one belonging to a board member or their friends. Inside, the room was decorated with cheap streamers and balloons, but the air was thick with pride. At the head of the room, Richard Cole stood with a glass of wine in his hand, his suit pressed neatly, his smile wide. The other board members surrounded him, their plates piled high with food paid for from HOA funds. They toasted each other, congratulating themselves as if they had won a war. "To our victory," Cole announced loudly, raising his glass, his voice echoing off the walls. One man thought he could challenge the HOA, and look what happened. His boat is ashes, and soon his house will follow if he doesn't learn. The crowd chuckled nervously, some clapping, others whispering. Neighbors who had been forced to attend stood stiffly, smiling only because they were watched. They didn't want to be there, but refusal meant fines or harassment. The board didn't notice their unease. They were too wrapped up in their arrogance. Another member, a tall man named Davis, laughed and said, "It's simple. People only obey when they're afraid. Now they all know, step out of line, and you'll end up like him." Cole smirked, sipping his wine. "Exactly. Fear keeps this place in order. They need us. Without us, this neighborhood would fall apart." The crowd clapped politely, though many eyes avoided his. The man himself stood in the back of the room, silent, unnoticed by most. He leaned against the wall, his arms crossed, his face calm. To anyone watching closely, he looked like he was just another neighbor forced to show up. But his eyes never left the board, studying them, memorizing every word. Every boast was another weapon for him to use. Every careless admission was proof of their corruption. He said nothing, did nothing, only let their arrogance fill the room like smoke. As the night went on, the board members grew louder, their laughter sharper. They spoke openly about money they had stolen. One woman bragged about the new pool project that had collected thousands from homeowners but had quietly gone into her personal account. Another man laughed about a road repair fund that never existed, saying, "Why fix a road when the money looks better in my pocket?" Their voices carried across the room, their words dripping with greed, but they felt untouchable. The man in the back only watched, his expression unreadable. In his mind, he pictured the folder waiting at home, the copies of documents already in the hands of lawyers, investigators, and even a reporter. He imagined the look on their faces when they realized every word they spoke tonight would one day be read back to them in court. He imagined the silence when their accounts froze, when their credit cards stopped working, when their empire collapsed not with fire but with numbers. Around him, neighbors whispered uneasily. Some glanced at him, wondering why he was there, why he stood so calm while the very people who destroyed his boat laughed in victory. One whispered, "Why doesn't he fight them? Why doesn't he say something?" The other shook their head. "He's waiting. He must be waiting." The board raised another toast, their voices booming. To control. To power. To the HOA. The room echoed with forced cheers, but in the corner, the man allowed himself the faintest of smiles. They thought this was their triumph, their proof of dominance. But to him, it was evidence. Every boast, every smirk, every word would feed the fire he was preparing. Not a fire of wood and rope, but of truth and law. The kind of fire that burned slower, deeper, and left nothing standing. As the night ended, the board stumbled out of the clubhouse, drunk on power and alcohol, their laughter trailing into the dark. Neighbors hurried home, their faces pale, their voices low. The man left last, walking into the night air, his steps steady. He paused at the edge of the lake, the black water reflecting the faint light from the clubhouse. For a moment he stared at the ripples, remembering his boat, remembering the flames. Then he whispered into the night, his voice calm but heavy with promise. "Celebrate while you can. Soon, the only thing you'll be toasting is your own end." The morning after the board celebration, the neighborhood was quiet, but inside the man's house, the silence was filled with purpose. The folder on his desk was no longer just a pile of papers. It was a weapon, and now it was time to use it. He sat in front of his computer, typing carefully, attaching documents, sending emails one by one. Each email carried a piece of the truth: bank records showing money vanishing, fake contracts with forged signatures, budgets with missing funds. Some went to county investigators, some to his attorney, and one to a journalist who had once exposed another HOA scandal that had destroyed an entire board. He didn't sign his name. He didn't need to. The evidence spoke louder than he ever could. Hours later, he made quiet phone calls, his voice calm and steady. "This is a tip," he said to the investigator. "Check the HOA's accounts. The money isn't where it should be." Then he hung up, no extra words, no explanations. He didn't ask for help. He was giving them a trail to follow, one that would lead straight to the board's corruption. By evening, the first ripples appeared. Richard Cole swaggered into the local diner, as he always did, and ordered his meal. When he pulled out his credit card to pay, the cashier frowned. "I'm sorry, sir. It's declined." Cole laughed, waving his hand as if it were a mistake. He tried another card. Declined. He tried a third. Declined again. His smile faltered, and for the first time in weeks, his voice wavered. Around him, neighbors pretended not to watch, but their eyes followed every movement. Cole stormed out, muttering angrily, but the seed of panic had already been planted. At the same time, Davis, another board member, stopped at a gas station. He slid his card into the pump, only to be met with an error. He tried again. Nothing. His phone buzzed with a notification: "Your account has been temporarily frozen." He stared at the screen in disbelief, his face pale. That night, the board members gathered in the clubhouse, their voices sharp and uneasy. "Something's wrong with the accounts," Davis said, his voice tight. I can't access anything. The treasurer, a woman named Linda, held up her phone with trembling hands. The HOA's main account, it's locked. I tried to pay the contractor for the landscaping, and the transfer was blocked. Richard slammed his fist on the table. This is a mistake. It has to be a mistake. But deep down, he knew. His face turned red, sweat shining on his forehead. Who did this? He demanded, his eyes darting around the room as if an enemy was hiding in the shadows. The man wasn't there. He didn't need to be. His strike was silent, invisible, leaving no trace but chaos. Across the neighborhood, whispers began to spread. Homeowners received letters that their dues payments had bounced back. Contractors refused to work, saying the HOA had no funds. Bills piled up unpaid, and for the first time, the board looked powerless. At home, the man sat by his window, watching the moonlight reflect on the lake. The place where his boat had burned was now still, the water calm again. He thought of the board panicking in the clubhouse, of their smug smiles turning into fear. He didn't smile, but his eyes glinted with quiet satisfaction. He whispered to himself, "You burned wood and rope. I burned every dollar you had." By the next day, the neighborhood buzzed with gossip. Did you hear? The HOA can't pay their bills. Cole's cards were declined in public. They are finished. Neighbors who had once feared the board now whispered with a hint of hope, their eyes turning toward the man's house with curiosity. They didn't know what he had done, but they could feel it. Something had shifted. Something bigger than fire was now burning the board alive. In the clubhouse, chaos only grew. Phones rang unanswered, threats turned into desperate excuses, and every attempt to fix the problem ended with more walls closing in. The man stayed silent, letting the storm unfold, letting them choke on the very power they had stolen. He didn't rush. He didn't gloat. He only waited for the next step, knowing the strike he had made was only the beginning. The next HOA meeting was meant to be another show of power. Richard Cole walked into the clubhouse in his suit, trying to hold his head high, but the weight on his shoulders was clear. His eyes darted nervously at the homeowners who had gathered in larger numbers than usual. Normally, people avoided these meetings out of fear, but tonight the room was full. Rumors of frozen accounts and unpaid bills had spread like fire through dry grass, and everyone wanted answers. The air was thick with tension, neighbors whispering, children peeking from behind parents, eyes fixed on the board. Davis sat at the long table with his papers scattered, his hands shaking as he tried to arrange them. Linda the treasurer kept checking her phone, her lips pressed tightly together, her face pale. Richard cleared his throat and forced a smile. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. There have been some temporary issues with the bank. His voice wavered slightly, but he pushed on. Everything is under control. Just technical errors. A murmur rose from the crowd. One man stood and held up a letter in his hand. If it's just errors, then why was my dues payment returned? A woman shouted from the back. Why did the landscapers quit? My yard is overgrown because you haven't paid them. Another voice joined, sharper, angrier. Where's the money, Richard? Richard's forced smile cracked. He slammed his hand on the table. Enough. You don't understand how complicated this is. We're fixing it. But his words didn't silence the crowd. Instead, the whispers grew louder, turning into accusations. People began demanding answers all at once, their voices overlapping in waves of anger. Davis leaned close to Richard, his voice low but desperate. We need to calm them down. Say something. Linda's phone buzzed again. She glanced at the screen, and her face drained of color. Richard, she whispered. The main account, there's nothing left. Frozen. Every dollar. Richard's hands clenched into fists. He tried to keep control, but sweat beaded on his forehead, his voice rising too quickly. This is just a misunderstanding, he shouted. The HOA is strong. We will recover. But his voice cracked, and everyone heard the weakness behind it. At the back of the room, the man stepped forward. He hadn't spoken in weeks. He hadn't shouted, hadn't argued, hadn't even raised his eyes. But now, every head turned toward him as he calmly walked down the aisle. He carried a folder in his hand, thick with papers. He stopped at the table, laid the folder down, and looked directly at Richard. His voice was calm, steady, but it carried through the entire room. You burned my boat. You fined me. You mocked me. But you made a mistake. You thought no one was watching. He opened the folder and spread out the papers, copies of bank statements, contracts with fake names, payments stolen from homeowners. Gasps filled the room. Here is where the money went, he said, pointing to the pages. Your vacations. Your cars. Your private accounts. The homeowners surged forward, craning their necks to see. Their shock turned into rage as they realized their dues had been stolen for years. Richard's face turned white, then red, then pale again. He stammered, This isn't real. Lies. All of it. But no one believed him anymore. Linda tried to grab the papers, but the man's hand pressed them flat against the table, his eyes cold. Try to deny it. The investigators already have copies. The county already knows. This meeting isn't your shield anymore. It's your trial. The crowd erupted. Shouts, demands, curses thrown at the board. Neighbors who had been silent for years now shouted for justice, their voices loud and fierce. Richard backed into his chair, his arrogance finally broken. Davis dropped his head into his hands. Linda whispered, We're finished, her voice trembling. The man looked at them one last time, his voice low but sharp. You thought fire would break me, but it only lit yours. Your accounts are gone. Your power is gone. And soon, your freedom will be gone too. The room went silent for a moment as his words settled like heavy stones. Then the shouting resumed, but this time it wasn't fear, it was rebellion. The neighborhood had turned against the board completely. Richard tried to speak again, but his voice was drowned in the noise. For the first time in years, the board sat powerless, their empire unraveling in front of everyone they had ruled. The man turned and walked away, leaving them surrounded by the furious crowd, his steps calm and steady. He didn't need to stay. The destruction of the HOA was no longer his fight. It had already begun, and nothing could stop it. Weeks passed after the meeting, but the echoes of that night never left the neighborhood. For years the board had walked tall, feared by everyone, their rules and fines crushing families one by one. But now their names were whispered with anger, their houses watched with contempt, their smiles gone. Investigators moved in quickly. Cars from the county office and unmarked black sedans appeared outside the board members' homes at dawn. Neighbors peeked through curtains as men in suits walked up driveways carrying folders and warrants. Richard Cole was dragged out in his bathrobe, shouting about mistakes and power plays. But the officers ignored his words. Davis tried to run, packing a bag and heading for his car, but two men blocked his path before he could even open the door. Linda wept as she handed over her phone, her accounts already frozen, her future slipping away with every signature on the investigators' papers. The entire neighborhood watched as the mighty board that once ruled them fell one by one, their power stripped, their voices silenced. The homeowners gathered outside, murmuring, some clapping quietly, others shaking their heads in disbelief. They had been ruled by fear for so long they had forgotten what it felt like to see justice delivered. Now they watched the very people who had stolen their money, their peace, their freedom, being loaded into cars like criminals. In truth, that was exactly what they were. At the edge of the crowd, the man stood silently, his hands in his pockets, his eyes calm as he watched Richard scream from the back of the car. For a brief moment their eyes met, and Richard's face twisted in rage and fear. But the man did not flinch. He only stared back, his expression unreadable, his silence louder than any insult he could have spoken. The cars drove away, the flashing lights disappearing down the road, leaving the neighborhood strangely quiet, as if the very air had been cleared of a long, heavy weight. Days later, a notice came. The HOA board had been dissolved. Control of the neighborhood was handed to a temporary committee until new leaders could be chosen. But everyone knew things would never return to the way they were. The fear was gone. The man did not attend the committee meetings. He did not care about titles or power. His fight had never been about leading anyone. It had been about justice, about showing the board that their fire could not break him. On a bright morning, he stood once again by the lake. The air was clean, the water calm, the reflection of the trees stretching like green walls across its surface. At the dock sat a new boat, small but strong, its wood fresh, its ropes tight. Neighbors stopped by, some offering smiles, others shyly thanking him for what he had done. He nodded politely, never boasting, never explaining more than necessary. He didn't need recognition. The lake itself, quiet and safe again, was enough. He untied the rope and stepped into the boat, letting it drift onto the water. As the waves lapped against its sides, he felt the weight of the past week's ease from his shoulders. The old boat was gone, burned to ash, but in its place stood something new, not just a vessel, but a symbol of what he had survived. He leaned back, his eyes on the horizon where the sun rose high, the same lake that had once held flames now holding only light. In the distance, children laughed on the shore, free from the watchful eyes of a corrupt board. Families sat outside without fear of fines or threats. The neighborhood was alive again. He thought of his father, of the lessons that had been passed down like the boat itself. Strength was not in shouting or rushing, but in patience, in silence, in waiting for the right moment. The HOA had mistaken his calm for weakness. But they had learned the truth too late. His silence had been their undoing. He whispered into the breeze, the words drifting across the water. "You burned my boat, but I burned your empire." The lake rippled gently, carrying the words away. And as the boat glided across the calm surface, the man knew that the battle was over, and justice had finally found its home on the water where it had all begun.